Good evening, everyone. This is Jean Rao. I'm the Associate Director of Survivorship Programs with the Young Survival Coalition. Tonight is my pleasure with YSC, Cancer Fight Club, BreastCancerTrials.org, and Sharsheret to present clinical trials and young women affected by breast cancer as Trailblazers, featuring Dr. Dizon. Dr. Dizon is a board-certified medical oncologist and specializes in women's cancers at the Massachusetts General Hospital Cancer Center. He is also the founder and the director of the Oncology Sexual Health Program. He's an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and continues to be actively involved in clinical research devoted to trials of new treatments through his work with NRG Oncology, where he is a member of the Phase 1 Cervix and Developmental Therapeutics committees. He serves on multiple national committees and is currently the co-chair of the National Cancer Institute's Gynecologic Cancer Steering Committee's Cervical Cancer Task Force. He is also an avid writer and editor and contributes actively to the ASCO member site Connection.org and an online column for the academic journal The Oncologist, as well as serving as a section editor in Gynecologic Oncology for the point-of-care online reference UpToDate. Prior to this event tonight, you will have seen that he also presented at our summit at the general session about clinical trials, and he also has a poignant column about two former patients, or two, they're probably still considered patients to him, about the participation piece when one patient was part of the trial and another was not. So if you haven't already had a chance to look at both of those, they are both available to you as well. After the program tonight, there will be a short evaluation, and we really hope that you will take part in that. Your feedback is vital to us to know how to further our programs for you. Please post your questions as we go along in the Facebook event. We will be monitoring those and providing them to Dr. Dizon. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dizon, and he will talk for approximately 10 to 20 minutes and then have an open discussion.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's going to be a very interesting experience. And it's my first Google Hangout with LBBC and everyone. And what I thought I'd do, instead of giving a didactic lecture, is really tell the story that Jean just told you about. One of my favorite programs on NPR is The Moth, and I like the fact that we can tell narratives, and I thought I'd just try to bring this live for you as a setup as to why clinical trials, I believe, are so important. So the column I'll read to you was entitled A Tale of Two Women, HER2-Positive Breast Cancer in Clinical Trials. Joan was 42, married, but when I met her, she appeared younger than that. Her husband was with her when we first met, as was her beautiful 2-year-old son. We couldn't get a babysitter, if you can believe that, she had said. Sarah, on the other end, was 38, was also married. She and I were closer to the same age, which really wasn't lost on me, and it wasn't lost on her either. She too had 3 kids, but she didn't bring them to her first meeting. She was only with her husband, and he held her hand throughout that entire first visit. I don't know what I'd do without him, she said through misty eyes. I saw both of them around the same time as consults regarding adjuvant treatment. Each had found a lump in her breast, undergone a biopsy, and had been diagnosed with invasive breast cancer. Joan's tumor was hormone receptor negative. Sarah's tumor was hormone receptor positive. However, both of their tumors were HER2 positive. They each had a similar tumor stage as well over 2 centimeters in size in terms of their breast cancer, and both of them had node-positive disease. Even now, I recall the lengthy discussions we had about both of their treatments, the value of chemotherapy for both, and then of endocrine therapy in Sarah's case, and the various combinations of chemotherapy that we could use. Because each had HER2-positive breast cancer, I also discussed the role of trastuzumab, which at that time was only being used to treat metastatic HER2-positive breast cancer. But as it turned out, our institution had participated on a clinical trial. It was a randomized trial that evaluated chemotherapy with or without adjuvant treatment using trastuzumab. I still remember giving both of them the informed consent, asking them to participate on this trial, and then sending them home to digest all the information we had talked about and to specifically think about whether or not they wanted to participate in this trial. When both of them returned, they each asked the same thing. What do you think I should do? And to each of them I gave a similar response. Given your cancer is HER2 positive, I would recommend chemotherapy, but I would recommend it on that trial. At this point, we don't know what the benefit of trastuzumab will be, and whether it will add to the effectiveness of chemotherapy. And more importantly, we don't know what the side effects will be, both in the short and in the long term. There is a 50-50 chance you'll get the trastuzumab, but at the very least, you will receive standard of care. Ultimately, both women agreed to enroll in the trial, and following consent, each had undergone randomization. Joan was assigned to treatment with chemo plus trastuzumab. Sarah assigned to treatment with chemotherapy alone. We met again to review the treatment plan, and I talked to them both about participating in the trial, making sure both of them still wanted to proceed. Sarah admitted to being disappointed and more than a little apprehensive because she had not been assigned to the arm receiving trastuzumab. Remember, Sarah, the trial is being done because there isn't a proven benefit to trastuzumab in this setting. Remember, too, your tumor expresses hormone receptors, so we have the option of endocrine treatment after chemotherapy completes. After our discussion, she clapped her hands and looked at me. Okay then, Sarah said, let's get going. Each woman tolerated treatment well, experiencing few side effects, and each greeted the end of therapy with a sense of accomplishment, if not relief, especially Joan, who completed a year of trastuzumab. Both women began follow-up with me, and although each had some issues in those first 6 months as treatment ended, they were back to a sense of normalcy within a year. A couple of years after they completed treatment, the joint analysis of this trial and another were reported, showing a survival advantage following the administration of adjuvant trastuzumab. Treatment with adjuvant trastuzumab reduced the recurrence risk by over 50% and reduced the risk of dying of breast cancer for women with HER2-positive disease by over 30%. The results generated a lot of press, and I made sure to touch bases with all of my patients who participated on that trial, which included both Joan and Sarah. Joan felt relief knowing she had received trastuzumab. So relieved she cried, "I feel like I won the lottery." The discussion with Sarah was more subdued. I'd expected her to be angry. I think that's probably how I would have reacted. But she wasn't. Although disappointed she did not receive trastuzumab, she was looking well past adjuvant treatment by then. Well, it was a 50-50 chance, she said. We talked about whether it made sense to start treatment again, but really she could not fathom returning to the infusion unit for a year of therapy. Therefore, we decided to resume follow-up. Then Sarah relapsed. She developed cancer in her bones and liver. It was news that she met with fear and with sadness, and her husband was devastated. They cried in my office, wondering about an uncertain future and about time. As in our meeting, they held hands. "Sarah, you are not dying," I said. "If I thought you were, I'd tell you, and if that time comes, I will. But right now the cancer is treatable, you have no symptoms, and you are healthy, and you have options. We can use trastuzumab. I'm optimistic I can help you live and live well." "But for how long?" she asked. It was her only question that day. Sarah embarked on treatment for metastatic breast cancer, and it was a journey that spanned over 6 years. In that time, her last child graduated high school, she buried both of her parents, and she traveled extensively. The use of anti-HER2 agents kept her disease in check and allowed her to live. That is, until her cancer began to show signs of resistance. Despite multiple attempts at treatment, her tumor became less responsive, and it started to progress. When she came in with pain and jaundice, I feared she had entered a terminal phase. I admitted her to the hospital, and we did an urgent CT. and unfortunately her liver was almost entirely replaced with cancer. I still remember going into her room and looking at her, and all I had to say is, "Sarah, it's time." She looked at me and said, "I know." As we discussed hospice, I told her and her husband what an honor it had been to be her doctor, to get a chance to know them as people, to meet their families. "I don't know how long you have, but I wanted to tell you that," I said. We chatted some more, cried together, confirmed our plans for her to be home. It was where she wanted to live, and it's where she wanted to die. On one of my last visits with her, I asked Sarah if she regretted participating in the trial. "No, I don't have any regrets. I knew what I was getting into, and I knew there were no guarantees about whether or not I'd be assigned to treatment with trastuzumab, let alone if it would work. If it helps women with breast cancer in the future, then it was worth it." Sarah died shortly after in the environment she had wanted, at home, surrounded by her husband, grown children, and many friends. Joan's course was dramatically different. Despite having hormone receptor negative disease, her cancer did not return. She saw me every 3 months, then every 6. Each time, her child was with her, and in a way I tied Joan's survivorship to the growth and development of her son, who went from a toddler to a little boy, fascinated with my stethoscope. We eventually reduced her visits to oncology, and I saw her only at annual follow-ups. At our last visit, I asked if she had any questions. "No," she said, "just thank you for the chance to be on that trial. It literally saved my life." We hugged, and she walked out of my office. Ultimately, I think progress in cancer care does require a partnership between researchers, clinicians, and patients. None of us are above the other. It's a collaboration, and it requires the utmost respect and the mutual trust. This is why I have always concluded people who participate in clinical trials should never consider themselves guinea pigs. They are trailblazers, partners as we fight for better. And so I wanted to use this blog as to set up what I hope this discussion will be about. I'm hoping it'll be a good back and forth between what I can help you understand about clinical research, even catch you guys up on anything you want to learn about it. But I will turn it over to Jean, and maybe we can start a discussion.
Thank you so much. That's such a great story, and I just feel so much admiration for those two women and taking the chances. And I'm so going to be so curious about some of the questions that are already coming in that we're sending to you as we're going along the way. Some of the things that I think have come up for us prior to your presentation tonight are questions like, if someone lives in a rural area, what's sort of the best way for them to find out information about how to find where a clinical trial is closest to them?
Mm-hmm. That's an important question, because one of the areas that we are most interested in addressing on a national level is disparities. And disparities can take many forms, but certainly access to trials and feasibility of doing trials is a huge one. At the National Cancer Institute does have a website called cancer.gov, and they have a clinical trials clearinghouse. And what's important about the clinical trials listings on the government website is that this is actually a requirement of all researchers. We must register all of our clinical trials with cancer trials, clinicaltrials.gov. And we have to keep our records accurate and timely. So this is an important research for everybody who is interested in trials, because you can search by geographic region. You could even delve down into a certain radius as to where you live. If there is a trial that you are interested in, then I think it behooves you to get in touch with the nearest center where that trial is being run and see what can be done to help you enter that trial. Most insurance companies, and this will vary by state, will cover the costs of a clinical trial as it relates to what would be considered standard of care. So costs that you would normally pay to get an infusion for chemotherapy, to see your doctor for safety, these kinds of things are paid for by insurance. Things that I do to monitor how well a clinical treatment works on trial would not be covered, but these would be covered by the sponsor of that trial, which in most cases will be either a cooperative group or it will be a pharmaceutical sponsor. But the important thing is that we try to minimize the out-of-pocket costs for our patients, and certainly there are now foundations that are available to help people get access to clinical trials and the logistics of actually enrolling in one. We're fortunate in Boston because we do have access to some of these foundations, but we are not alone in Boston of having them. And I think folks like the groups that are really coming together to sponsor this broadcast are important because they can provide you with the ground level support to get involved in clinical trials themselves.
Right, thank you. I do also want to just add that oftentimes it's important to check with, if there's a social worker or a nurse navigator, they
Right.
might know of good assistance programs that can help with things that are not coming out of your pocket. So while there are certain pieces of it that do get covered by the clinical trial, you can work with your healthcare provider team to find out what assistances might be available to you.
Right.
One of the other questions that came up in the very beginning is, how is immunology changing treatment for women with breast cancer?
Well, that's a great question. It's also very relevant these days. The whole notion of immunotherapy is actually exploding across solid tumors. It began with really difficult to treat cancers like melanoma and renal cell cancers, but it's extending now to lung cancer. And yes, it is coming into the realm of breast cancer therapies as well. I consider it another arm of treatment that has yet to be fully explored. So just like we've discovered HER2-targeted treatments for HER2-positive breast cancers, there may be a subgroup of patients who are exquisitely more sensitive to immunotherapy. But right now, I can just say that immunotherapy is not standardly available, but is an area that we are actively pursuing across solid tumors, and this definitely includes in breast cancer.
Great, thank you. Another question that's been posted is, what do you have to say about aspirin affecting tumor growth?
Yeah, well, I think for breast cancer, it's not entirely clear, but certainly aspirin is a great risk-reducing agent for other cancers, and I'm thinking really of colorectal cancers today. For women who have breast cancer already, I'm not aware of good or great data even that aspirin will reduce the risk of having it return or has an effect in women who are living with disease that's been established in their liver or their lungs. I look at aspirin in the realm of preventing breast cancer from occurring in the first place, but as I am sort of critical of our national media, there is nothing that we can really do to prevent breast cancer short of mastectomy. What we are really talking about is reducing risk. Aspirin falls into that category of potentially being chemoprevention, but even if you are taking an aspirin a day, that is not 100% protective against getting breast cancer.
Thank you. That kind of segues into another question that is posted, which is, what role do you see social media playing in trial creation and accrual?
Well, I think we are looking at an era where the patient is no longer just a participant on our clinical trials. There is a very large movement afloat nationally to bring patients in at the planning stages of any clinical trial, to look at what is feasible in terms of, what we expect of participants, and to really listen to them and their advice about how to conduct trials so that we are not faced with a lot of people either unwilling to do our trials or else unable to do our trials because of the requirements that are placed on them. So I think in that spirit of increased engagement in just even the planning process, I see social media as a really an untapped arena where we can coalesce as a large focus group around objectives of trials, vetting whether or not hypotheses make sense, all the way to forming communities within clinical trials for participants to talk to each other and share strategies about how they are doing and what works in terms of toxicities. Probably the hardest thing for any of our patients to do on a trial is to run into a side effect and feel it's only happening to them. I think it might be incredibly helpful if we were able to form communities around our clinical trials and utilize social media to make that happen, because there's a shared experience that I think can help people feel like they're a part of something bigger rather than a spoke in a wheel or just a number on a trial, which no one should ever feel that way.
In part of your program at the summit, you talked about how the biggest problem with clinical trials is the lack of participation.
Yeah.
Keeping people enrolled or even getting them enrolled. And as an oncology social worker who's worked on the provider side and now on a programmatic side, I have heard survivors often say, no one ever told me, or if I go to clinicaltrials.gov, it just feels so overwhelming. I'm just wondering about the beginning steps to building a bridge between those two things. Right. What do you think about that?
Well, I do think it's really important that patients feel like they're being given the time to really learn about a trial, and that not feel like there is pressure to sign up or else slots are gone. We have to remember that we are not just treating a cancer, we're treating patients. So there's very practical things that I've adopted in my own clinical relationships, which I think have helped me personally. I discuss trials before I bring out the informed consent for a specific trial. Then I discuss the informed consent, and then my nurse discusses the informed consent. But most importantly, I send it home. So people are not signing up for anything on the day that I bring it up with them. They might come back 2 days later, they might come back a week later, but it's that time to just digest what the trial is saying, look at a schedule, see if it works out for them, and then if they decide not to do it, making them not feel like you are disappointed. Because ultimately, I'm not the one who has to do this trial. It's going to be this person who I'm asking to do a trial. And that's the collaborative experience of clinical trials. I think the ones that I've had the most effectiveness in having people complete a trial, it's because communication channels have always been open. But Jean, you're right. Those communication channels have got to stay open from even before they enter the trial. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got some pretty specific questions, so I'll just read them out. One says, when can we expect the U.S. expect to have a medication for those who are triple negative and BRCA positive?
Well, that's a really good question. As you know, the women with triple negative breast cancers are being or they should undergo genetic testing, even if their family history is not suggestive of familial breast cancer. But we know that triple-negative disease is more commonly associated with mutations in BRCA. So the question is entirely relevant: when are we going to have a therapy for BRCA mutation-related cancers? And I'm hoping it's soon. Certainly there is an FDA-approved PARP inhibitor that is useful for BRCA-related cancers. The approval is specific. It's for ovarian cancer, not for breast. But if we extrapolate what we're learning in the ovarian cancer clinical research, there may even be women who do not have a genetic BRCA mutation, but whose tumor has a genomic mutation in BRCA. So the pool of patients who may actually be eligible for PARP inhibitors and indeed may actually benefit from PARP inhibitors may actually be quite larger than we think. I think there's some deliberateness in terms of trying to explore who these patients are, but I can tell you without a doubt the research is ongoing in trying to get these drugs approved for a wider indication than women with ovarian cancer, but to get them into the hands of patients with BRCA positive mutations. And beyond that, the world of genetics is becoming more complicated, and as we learn more about the other genetic mutations that may confer or do confer an increased risk of breast cancer, who knows, in 5 years or maybe sooner or maybe a little bit later, there may be even more drugs specific to the mutations that are associated with breast cancer. So to answer the question more specifically, I'm hoping it happens sooner than later, but I do know that you have an incredibly passionate, dedicated research community that matches the advocacy community around this topic.
Thanks. One of the themes that we hear often from constituents is that people see clinical trials as a last resort. Yep. After running through any and all other options, and that clinical trials, and you and I have talked about this, they turning people into guinea pigs. Yeah. And trying to get away from that notion and trying to build education and messaging around clinical trials not being a last resort.
Right. Well, I think that's important. And I like forums like this because I think it's a way for us to keep reiterating the important points about clinical trials, that not all of them have the same objectives, that in drug development, particularly in oncology, there are 3 phases of clinical trials. There are the very early clinical trials called phase 1, where we are not even looking to see how active a drug is. We want to understand its toxicities, and we want to understand more about how it should be delivered. So those phase 1 trials are first in human studies, or maybe first in breast cancer studies. Any drug that looks promising, that we understand its toxicity based on those completed phase 1 studies, if there's an indication that it might actually work specifically in breast cancer, they move forward into the phase 2 trials where we ask, in population X, what is the activity of this drug? And that activity might be different things to different people. So it's really important that you understand in this phase 2 trial, what exactly are you trying to find out? It might be, well, how well does it get tumors to shrink, so-called response rate? Or it might be, how many people stay on this drug for 6 months or longer and don't have any disease progression? Or it might be, how many people actually survive after taking this drug. Those are the endpoints that are in phase 2, but importantly, it's the phase 2 trials that does not have a placebo or a control arm. In most cases in phase 2, everyone gets the drug. If it looks incredibly promising, then it is important that we apply what we've learned in phase 1 and phase 2 into the phase 3 trial, which is where we try to change standard of care by asking the question, does this drug do better than we can do right now? And my patients that I wrote about were in a phase 3 trial. These were not patients who were heavily treated for breast cancer. Both of them entered after having primary surgery, and they joined me in trying to answer a really important question that at the end of the day changed the approach to HER2-positive breast cancer. So that contribution, those women who participated on that randomized trial are a part of history in medical oncology because they changed the way we treat breast cancer today. And in fact, they've helped us cure some women with HER2-positive disease. So again, part of this is understanding what options are open when you want to explore it. It might be that your doctor has incredibly strong feelings about how to treat your cancer at any one time, and maybe not that open to considering clinical trials. And if that might be completely true, that we have a very good idea of what's going to work for you, but it's not. It's no longer a paternalistic society within medicine. It is, if there is a question in your head, whether it be, should I have a second opinion? Can I get the pathology to be re-reviewed? Are there any clinical trials I should be looking at? These are questions that any oncologist should be able to engage with you. And I am hoping to empower patients more to challenge their doctors to see what else can I do beyond the standards of care. And so it doesn't have to be trials only come in after you've exhausted all your options. There are trials with various types of eligibility criteria. I think the way to find out what's open for you in this time where you are in your disease is to ask your doctor, what trials should we be considering for me? Gene, I can't really see you. I think we're running into some technical problems. There. Hi, Gene.
Okay. So one of the things I just want to add to that is we really encourage all of young women at any stage and at any point in her journey to be good self-advocates. And not that all doctors are like this, but they may run into the situation where, as you said, the oncologist may not have the support in place that the patient wants. And in that situation, it's really, really important to advocate for yourself and get a second opinion. And while it may feel like it's just more work for you to do sometimes that's what it takes to make sure that you're informed. Another question that comes up sometimes is about, if I participate in a clinical trial, does that mean that's it for me and there's no more treatment available, or may I receive further treatment after participating in a clinical trial?
I think it's important for everyone to know that the trial is not a one-way contract, that you retain all your rights as a human being and as a patient of that center for care. So one of the important things I tell my patients who enter trials, you have the right always to stop treatment on this trial, and we will revert back to whatever we can do off that trial to continue your care. And in that vein, it's important to know that clinical trials do not represent the final stop in treatments. Very often, in fact, actually, what I should say is part of the consent process of clinical trials is to present alternative options if you choose not to do the clinical trial. So it has been a very rare circumstance where I have not been able to offer further treatment for patients who are coming off a clinical trial. Now, Jean mentioned a scenario where trials come in after a patient has gone through many, many types of therapy. The standing point there is not necessarily there is nothing left to try, but it's a very dynamic situation. It might be that there are physical, clinical reasons that treatment no longer becomes the option. In the patient I presented, her liver had started to give out because of the sheer volume of cancer within it. In that kind of situation, further treatment bordered on unethical and likely would have hastened her death, and she would not have enjoyed time at home with her family. So if someone's coming off a clinical trial in the background of significant treatments prior to that, it might be the thing that stops it is not the lack of options, but that the disease process has gone on for so long that further treatment just doesn't make sense. But that is not the scenario for everybody. And certainly folks who enter clinical trial earlier on in the process should be assured that there are multiple ways to treat breast cancer beyond the trial. What we are saying is that the trials should always be considered an option no matter where you are in the process.
We've had Ellie Cohen from breastcancertrials.org join us, and she was having a little bit of difficulty getting onto the page. And while you've already touched on this, would you mind revisiting the role of immunotherapy in cancer clinical trials? Because that's a specific question she had.
So, you know, the ones that are most promising right now are the ones that are using PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors to sort of stimulate the immune system to target cancer cells and utilize the immune reaction to cancer. And these are the drugs that have really shown significant benefits in melanoma, lung cancer as well. And these are ones that we're using more and more in clinical trials. However, there are other ways to target the immune system or harness an immune response. And certainly, you know, breast cancer vaccines have been tried, continue to be tried. Formulations are continuing. There's even drugs that are using either viruses or non-dangerous engineered bacterium to help deliver an immune response if it's conjoined with a protein. So there are various ways to use immunotherapy. I think it is safe to say that the breast cancer research community sees significant potential in utilizing the immune modulatory drugs, but also other ways to target the immune system. And I think it's something we're going to see in the very near future in terms of some promise. Right now, though, there's a lot of hope. That hope needs to be tested, and so it's not ready to come out of clinical trials for use today. But if anybody is interested in immunotherapy for breast cancer, for their breast cancer, I would highly encourage you to participate in one of those trials.
Thank you. We have a couple of new questions. One comment that says recurrence is a fear that all of us have, and there is very little funding for metastatic breast cancer. And the question is, what can we do to increase funding for stage 4?
You know, I've been tremendously impressed about the passion that women with metastatic breast cancer bring to any discussion and forum. And I think it has been revelatory to see what advocacy can accomplish, particularly for women whose concerns and voices really weren't that it wasn't something we thought about as far back as 5 years ago. But now we have a Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance that is trying to increase the research in metastatic disease. We are now pushing our fundraisers to dedicate time on the platform and funding to treatments in metastatic disease. And so I think what we can do as a community who are worried about relapse risk, want to understand how to prevent or even protect themselves from experiencing a recurrence, and then even to have treatment options available for a recurrent or metastatic disease. It's important to continue to speak with one voice and say, don't forget, we women with stage 4, we are still here. We have very much are invested in living and living well, and our concerns need to be addressed. But one thing I will say is that much of drug development occurs in women who have metastatic disease. Our first signals are oftentimes going to be in women who have had prior therapies, because oftentimes that's where we can perform trials and ask questions with a pretty defined group of women that we want to study specifically or more precisely. Plus, there's always that argument that unless we know something is effective, it may not make sense to test it on women who have just been recently diagnosed when we have standard therapies that are pretty good. So a lot of drug development happens with women who have metastatic disease and then gets moved up to the adjuvant setting. So it might seem like there's not a lot of work ongoing, but indeed a lot of what folks will be doing in sort of the phase 1, phase 2 area are going to be in women with metastatic disease, and we need to look at that as well.
Thank you. Another question that's come over is, are there any cancer prevention trials going on right now that you would recommend survivors look into?
So this would be for women who have had breast cancer and are looking to reduce their risk of relapse in terms of prevention. That's what we are talking about. There's, I can't think of a specific or precise trial where the endpoint in women without Evans disease is to reduce the risk of recurrence. Most of our trials that are happening post-treatment are looking at ways to improve quality of life, reduce fatigue, for example, and improve stamina, because we are very cognizant now, after listening to our patients, that life after treatment of breast cancer is very different from what it was like before we were diagnosed. And so that voice of concerns is usually, that's really where a lot of work is going in terms of how can we improve the post-cancer experience. And I think that's an entirely relevant area, even for patients who may be looking at more therapy for metastatic disease, asking the questions of how can we improve your quality of life while you're on therapy for what we like to term a chronic illness. Okay, that's a really legitimate area of concern. There is an interesting field that you might hear more about in the coming months that merges lifestyle medicine with sort of improved outcomes. And it's a field that I'm most familiar with from the work at Memorial Sloan Kettering, but it's called Exercise Oncology. And it's really trying to pinpoint how to harness cardiovascular health and improve outcomes specific to cancer. Again, it's an incredibly early field. A lot of the work is being done in the laboratory, but it's an area of research that merges the interests of our patients. You know, they want to be more healthy so that they feel better. They want to recover to who they were before breast cancer. And if we can also show that those modifications in lifestyle, those interventions targeting women after they've been treated, might actually benefit in terms of surviving breast cancer, I think that would be incredibly important information. But for now, if you're interested in trials for patients who are completing therapy, a lot of these will be posed in the survivorship space, and a lot of them will be geared towards lifestyle modification, increasing uh, healthy lifestyles.
Thank you. We had a question early on that I want to make sure that I don't leave out. It's a very specific question. I'm just finding the comment. What do you recommend for a 6-month breast cancer screening for a woman under 40, gene negative? MRIs give a lot of false positives. MRI, ultrasound, or mammogram?
You know, I think at this time, we're not using MRIs for women who do not have a BRCA mutation. Only very specific centers are able to do a diagnostic screening or a screening whole breast ultrasound. And I don't think that's ready for universal use. So unfortunately, or fortunately, I think what we are looking at is mammograms. And then on an individualized basis, asking the question, does an MRI make sense? And we all know and are very cognizant of the fact that mammography is not sensitive for younger women. But you know, it's still the place that most of our surgeons and our radiologists will start in terms of their surveillance screening post-treatment. My experience in Rhode Island, when I saw a lot of younger women with breast cancer, was it was very difficult to get MRIs in the absence of a known genetic mutation for that follow-up. And I always worried about the exact issue that was raised of the false negative results and chasing biopsy after biopsy for findings to the point where the woman is or the patient just can't psychologically deal with it and requests the bilateral mastectomy.
Thank you. Ellie from Breast Cancer Trials is asking if you could comment about epidemiological studies such as the Health of Women study for the Cancer Support Community Cancer Experience Registry, which are not trials, but provide ways for any person with breast cancer to participate in research that don't require travel.
Right. You know, I think that's an important point, that not all research is drug-related and not all research is therapeutic. In fact, there's a lot of research going on trying to understand better the lived experience after breast cancer, and for younger women, the challenges of living after breast cancer. So there are these registry studies, and one is being led by my colleague Ann Partridge at Dana-Farber, and it's a young women's study, and it's trying to better understand the issues and how they change as women live beyond breast cancer and deal with issues of age. What is the impact of chemotherapy-induced menopause on patients as they age into their 30s and 40s or 50s? What is the experience psychologically of having had breast cancer early in life as you're reaching into your 40s and 50s? So I think there have been a lot of questions that have been raised, and certainly it's not specific only to women with uh, uh, younger women with breast cancer. There has been the sister study that looked at the sisters of women who had breast cancer and trying to understand better the role of the environment in causing breast cancer and in subsequent health. Um, I am very interested, and I've sort of put it out there, that I think a similar study needs to be done for women with metastatic disease. That we need to enroll women at their point of diagnosis on such a registry and just understand what is their experiences, what motivates them to do clinical trials, and what makes them terrified to do clinical trials. What is their experience as they live through this year after year? And then we can target interventions that might speak to these groups, but then break it down even more succinctly um, into uh, for the lack of a better word, subgroups of women and their concerns and how they all change with time. Um, but sometimes registry studies is not only the most practical way to do it, it's really the most feasible way to do research into understanding the lived experience of breast cancer.
Okay, the last two questions is kind of a two-pronged approach before we wrap up this hour. Are all trials about new treatment? And are there trials that look at reducing side effects of
Mm-hmm.
treatment?
Mm-hmm. Um, so the answer to the first question is no. Not all trials are therapeutic in terms of trying to increase the options of therapy for women with breast cancer. There are studies that are ongoing to look at how best to treat side effects, and I think we might see a lot more of that. One of the presentations at the annual meeting of ASCO this year looked at a new way to potentially treat cancer cachexia. So cachexia is that wasted look that sometimes patients get as they're fighting cancer. It's that, and quite frankly, it's disfiguring, and patients are terrified of developing cachexia because they look like, or they look sick. So there's actually there was a drug that was tested, and it was based on you know basic science understanding of what might be driving cancer cachexia, and the study was promising. Um, uh, there were some concerns about how the study was designed, and it would have been incredibly helpful to have patient input on how to design that study, but they completed it. So there are studies looking at treatment-related as well as cancer-related side effects. There's a whole bunch of studies going on still on how to best treat nausea that is associated with chemotherapy. There are studies about fatigue, and there are studies about chemobrain. And I'm hoping next year to start studies about how to improve sexual health. If there is an incredible acknowledgement that the experience of breast cancer isn't specific to the disease.
Thank you, and a huge thank you to Dr. Dizon for spending this hour with us. A couple of housekeeping things that I want to remind you about. This page will be open for one more hour, and you can post your comments and questions, and we will look at those tomorrow and gather answers and post them on our main Facebook page. We also plan to do a blog about this event, and we'll have links to the YouTube channel where this entire hour has been recorded, and you can go back to it in case you think maybe I need to go back and listen again to that one question and answer piece. So know that that's always going to be available to you. There will be an evaluation link that we are asking you to please fill out. It's very short. It shouldn't take you even 5 minutes to complete. If you are watching tonight to get the 1 hour of free continuing education, please look on the event site for the photo that was posted earlier today from Commonwealth Seminars to know how to access that. If you have any problems with that, please do let me know. My email is on the site. We'll post it again tomorrow. And if you know of people who were not able to be on the call tonight, on the webinar tonight, again, it will be posted on YouTube, and the CEU will be available for obtaining up to 1 year. We want to thank breastcancertrials.org, Cancer Fight Club, and Sharsheret for hosting with us tonight. And we hope that you have enjoyed it as much as we have, and we look forward to hearing your comments and your feedback and for future YSC events.